The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the Agenda's Week in Review looks at where the NDP stands in this federal election campaign, Canada's search for allies in its tariff war with the U.S., and much more. But first, John Michael McGrath and Jessica Smith-Cross from the Trillium discuss the launch of the federal election campaign. On Polly is next.
You are not Steve Paikin.
I am not Steve Paikin. This is not his charming mug.
No, your charming mug, though. You are joining us once again. We had you on the podcast a few weeks ago for the election, or for the provincial election. Now we've got the federal election, and we thought we would have you on again. Steve will be back next week. I don't want anybody to panic, but welcome.
Thank you. I was really excited about coming on today. I didn't have a Bill Davis shirt, though.
We'll allow it. You are wearing something else instead.
I am wearing a jean shirt, and I'm wearing jeans, so I'm getting as close as I can to the Canadian tuxedo, hoping to tap into that, really.
The national sentiment across the land right now, yes. I'm wearing a Blue Jays hoodie to honor the home opener, which happened yesterday and was incredibly disappointing, and let's speak no further of it.
I'm sorry for all of us.
Let's remind our audience about who you are and the Trillium, which you are the editor-in-chief for.
That's right. I am the editor-in-chief of the Trillium. We're an online all Ontario politics, all Ontario policy news site. You can read our stuff on your local village media news outlet, Sioux Today, Toronto Today, everything in between. But for all of our coverage, even all the insidery stuff, you subscribe.
It's great to have you with us again, Jessica. And with that, let's go to issue 1. Late last week, Prime Minister and Liberal leader Mark Carney called a snap election for April 28th, which means Ontarians will vote a second time this year. Jessica, what's the state of play so far?
Well, it looks like the Liberals to lose right now, which is kind of surprising. Most polls have the Liberals leading the Tories, which looked very impossible just a few months ago. So this is wild in politics. You don't see such a change all that often. So before Justin Trudeau resigned, before Mark Carney won the leadership, and before Trump and his tariffs did everything to mess with Canadian politics, the Conservatives looked like they were going to win this thing. It didn't look like anything was going to change that. It looked like the Liberals were in for like a historically bad showing, but that's all changed. And so we're talking Ontario politics here, though not federal, and there's been sort of a fascinating through story about that this week. The Toronto Star learned that Campaign Research, which is like the PC's internal
in-house polling firm.
Yeah.
This is Nick Kouvalis' firm, yes.
Yes, and has helped the PCs do very well in Ontario for a long time now. So they have a poll showing the federal Tories just doing terribly in Ontario, losing to the Liberals right after the Ford PCs had won a whopping majority. And Ford's campaign manager gave this poll to the Star to let everybody know, and then went on the record to say, like, these guys are going to get obliterated if they don't change their way. So maybe there's been some tension between federal, provincial cousins here, but it's been sort of a fascinating story for the week in Ontario politics.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic right now between the federal and provincial Conservative parties is so fascinating, and honestly, we might have to do a whole other episode just devoted to that. But just on the rapid shift in the polling numbers, I was talking to one of our colleagues yesterday and saying that it's almost like if you've looked at like any of the charts that were affected by COVID-19, like a GDP chart, right? Yeah. Where for the rest of time, we're always going to be able to see that weird swing in the chart. It's like Canadian polling almost looks like that wild right now, where you saw the Liberals just slump, and then suddenly it's like a straight line back up again.
Up like
it's just
rocket.
The craziest thing to see. The reason for that, we think, the question framing this election so far seems to be who will deal with Donald Trump better. The latest development as we record this, and Lord knows it could change before this goes to air, is a 25% tariff from the United States on all foreign cars that would apply to Canadian-made goods, we think. But car parts are also supposed to be included in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement that was negotiated in Trump term 1. I guess we're going to get better details on April 2nd when it's actually supposed to be implemented. But let's talk a little bit about how have the candidates in the federal election reacted to this news.
Yeah, everybody's condemned it. That's clear all around. Everybody's very serious, taking on their most national leader tones to call it words like a full frontal attack on Canadian auto workers. That was Jagmeet Singh. A direct attack on Canada. That was Mark Carney. Pierre Poilievre up talking about Canada having to retaliate. Carney briefly suspended his election campaign to go into prime minister mode and have a meeting with his council on Canada-U.S. relations to talk about the country's response. He's already announced some policy measures in his capacity as prime minister. So a $2 billion fund to help the auto sector affected, some things to help corporate Canada, like deferring income tax, GST and HST remittances until the end of June. Poilievre's line is that Trump should knock it off, like they're a misbehaving child, and
yes.
I think I told my own children to knock it off. But he also says that if Trump doesn't, Canada will be stronger. Under 4 years of a conservative leadership, Canada will be strong enough to go on its own. It will use its resources, which he'll unlock, and then we'll sell them to other buyers other than the U.S.
Right. So some of those measures, like the GST and HST remittances, are very familiar if you remember COVID, which is now 5 years ago. But the similar policies were announced then. Obviously, you can see these governments sort of going back to policies that they adopted last time. I also want to sort of mention, because we love to talk about the caretaker convention on this podcast. It does also apply federally, and there is, I think, some debate to be had about just how far Carney can go as prime minister in the middle of an election that he called. The usual exceptions for the caretaker convention, which are supposed to constrain the power of the government during an election period, are emergencies, which you could argue this is, or if the measure is uncontroversial, which in this context would mean, do the other parties agree to it? I think, broadly speaking, we will see a lot of support for retaliatory tariffs, that kind of thing. But is Pierre Poilievre going to come out and say, yes, I support these measures that Prime Minister / Liberal leader Carney is announcing? That will be an interesting thing to watch. Is there anything else that we should know so far?
Well, we all know we know now that Mark Carney is going to run in the Ottawa riding of Nepean, which is kind of fun. It's right beside Pierre Poilievre's riding.
They're going to be neighbors.
Yeah, good neighbors. There's a bit of an interesting backstory to that. The riding had been held by a Liberal, Chandra Arya, since 2015. But then he ran in the leadership race for the Liberals, but was disqualified. We've since learned, thanks to the Globe and Mail's reporting, that this had to do with a trip to India in which he visited Prime Minister Narendra Modi and didn't tell anybody about. And so he's been disqualified. That opened up this Ottawa area for Carney to run in, which is where Carney lives now not where in Ottawa he lives, but in Ottawa, the city where he lives.
I have to say, Arya's response to the Globe and Mail reporting was kind of astonishing, where he met with a foreign head of government and didn't tell the prime minister or anybody in foreign affairs, and when asked about it by the Globe and Mail, said, well, I travel a lot and I meet lots of people.
It's prime minister of a country we're not on great terms.
Yes, obviously, in the context of a country that is credibly accused of murdering Canadian citizens, this is more than just you didn't meet your uncle for lunch,
He said a few eye-raising things during the leadership race. He also talked about how speaking French wasn't all that important. He just, from the get-go, was an odd fit in the leadership politics.
Yeah, well, he will no longer be in federal politics, and perhaps Mark Carney will win that seat. All right, on to issue 2. A new poll from Angus Reid shows that some premiers are receiving the Trump bump, a sudden rise in approval ratings amidst the U.S. president's tariff threats. Among those receiving the bump is Doug Ford. He's still the third least popular premier in Canada, but it is certainly a change in fortunes. Jess, what do you make of this?
That people like Doug Ford in a time of crisis. We've talked a little bit already on this show about how things now feel like they were in COVID for various reasons. That's what this feels like too to me. So according to this poll, Ford's popularity has risen 14 points to 48%. That's a measure of like you take away how many people don't like you from the way how many do. So it's a 48% approval rating. He's been hovering in the low 30s for like the past 2 years since his last rise during COVID. But his reaction to Donald Trump's tariff has given him a massive boost, another kind of skyrocketing chart that we can see there. So like before during COVID, there are some similarities. We see that Doug Ford, who's in Captain Canada or leadership mode, he's talking in front of the cameras more than he usually does, and he's doing it in that sort of plain-spoken, you can trust me way. And he's also talking a lot about working with the federal Liberals, which is something that it seems like people in Ontario like to see. He's the guy who's going to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, and he's not putting partisanship in front of that. I think that might explain a lot of this shooting up in the polls.
Yeah, and it's worth distinguishing between Ford's personal approval rating and the obvious fact that even though he let's say charitably call it middling personal approval ratings, he still just won a pretty handy majority in the legislature. There's always a difference between the approval ratings that voters give to individual politicians versus the question of will you vote for their party in the next election. So that said, I think it's pretty clear that you're right here, that the Premier's tough talk and his that style of like coming to the microphone and giving people kind of briefings, right? That worked for him well in COVID. It seems to be working for him well now. But the tenor, I think, has changed. It's not quite as combative as it had been a few weeks ago. He's cooled off a little bit on some of the language that he was using about Donald Trump and the White House. We are, as I say, holding our breath a bit to learn what exactly is going to happen on April 2nd. These auto tariffs, there's still, frankly, some ambiguity about those. And then there's like the rest of the universe that isn't auto tariffs, and we'll see how that goes. Do you think that the Premier taking at least a small step back here, like cooling the language off a little bit, will affect that image, that Captain Canada image that he is portraying?
Yeah, he has. And he's talked about taking the temperature down on purpose. But then he's still delivering lines like, we're going to make sure that the President of the United States feels Americans' pain in a way that they've never felt it before. So taking the temperature down isn't like all the way down, maybe more of a simmer. And but he has also not committed to bringing back the electricity surcharge.
Okay.
So he had very briefly put on an extra surcharge on the electricity that we export to the United States. And that's what actually caught the attention of Donald Trump to Doug Ford for the first time. Yeah. But he has still backed off that. So he backed off that when Trump decided to not escalate tariffs on steel and aluminum even farther. And now he says he's being very wary about doing that again because he doesn't want to prompt retaliation that will harm the rest of the country. Right. So it's a reasonable argument about keeping the whole national interest in mind.
Yeah, and Trump is doing things like posting to Truth Social that if Canada and the EU work together to inflict economic harm on the U.S., then he's going to retaliate. There's this whole vibe of like, how dare you fight back? That is, I don't quite know how Canada or Ontario is going to be able to respond to it. Andrew Furey, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, who called Trump a maniac, has actually received the biggest Trump bump, giving him the highest approval rating in the country. So clearly we see that opposing Trump is a popular stance, but the premiers, I have to imagine, they want to cut a deal fast when we know who the next prime minister is, or the current prime minister if he wins re-election, or sorry, Carney will be winning his first election. I keep having to remember that. They are going to want to cut a deal so the next 4 years are not entirely consumed by tariffs. Do we think that there might actually be a post-Trump slump to match the bump if things settle down?
I think it depends. Like, are we talking Danielle Smith type of capitulation here? Right? So she has been risking a lot with her more friendly attitude towards the United States. She's going down there. She's talking to conservatives in a very friendly way. And that seems to be hurting her, at least in like the national view of her. Yes. I think if the other premiers tone it down a bit to secure a deal, they're not going to receive a huge backlash. I like to think that most voters would say like, okay, it's worth us to play nice a bit to receive less economic pain, but you don't know, right? This like nationalism feeling that people are having, right, is very strong, and people feel very good when they are told about how strong Canada is and how strong we are fighting back. So maybe they will receive a Trump slump in a little while. And then there's just like the passage of time, right?
Yes.
Maybe one day we will get to move on to other issues, and this won't be top of mind anymore. I hope at some point that happens. And at that point, we could see the approval ratings come down again. This is what happened with Doug Ford, sort of in late COVID, as things sort of wore on, dragged on. This, as they started to get into the rearview mirror, his approval ratings slumped down again to closer to where they were before the whole thing began.
Well, someday we might be able to move on from Trump and his tariffs, but for us right now, we are going to move on to issue 3. On April 1st, 10 of Ontario's supervised consumption sites are slated to close due to a law that prohibits their operation within 200 meters of a school or childcare centre. However, comments from a government lawyer seem to contradict those from the Minister of Health, Sylvia Jones. Jess, this was a story that Jack Howan at the Trillium got, and it caught my eye. So why don't you tell our audience about it?
Yeah, Jack did a great job here. So he was covering these court hearings for this injunction, trying to get the courts to say that the province can't shut down these supervised injection sites right away while this court hearing is being heard. Now, one of the lawyers working for the government on this, his name's Zachary Green, was making an argument in court that said that these sites actually could just move, that all the government was doing was stopping them from being within 200 meters from a school. But Health Minister Sylvia Jones has not been saying that. And on that very day, after the lawyer said it in court, Jack went to her office. They confirmed, no, they can't move. Part of this is we're stopping anybody from setting up new ones. And that includes the new one you'd have to set up to relocate and move. So that's maybe doesn't look great on the government's side of things. And one of the important things about this court case, at least for the advocates involved, is that if they can't set up elsewhere, if they can't move, there isn't going to be any other options for the people who rely on these sites to stay alive.
Right. And so just to give a bit more of the background, if I can, I mean, the issue here is that the Charter protects, among other things, the right to personal security and the right to life, if I could put it that way. And the question here is whether this change in policy is in fact going to lead to people suffering and dying. And the court is going to have to adjudicate on that decision. But on the precise matter here, right? The question, like, even if a safe consumption site could muster the resources to move, that's a complex logistical operation. These are not, simply like 4 walls and a roof kind of facilities. There seem to be impassable legal hurdles in practice.
Yeah, the health minister's word here is going to be law. They're not going to let them open up anywhere else, which means, so according to Health Canada, there are 23 sites in Ontario, not all of them provincially funded, but open. 13 will remain open. And in some places, there are none at all. Like some parts of the province, there are none at all. There were none at all, or in some cases, the only one that was there is getting shut down. And so the advocates who are launching this charter challenge and who are fighting on behalf of these say that the ones that even are left are going to be overwhelmed with demand, and they are arguing that it's going to cause death. Street Health, which is a Toronto-based organization, is hiring grief counselors to help the staff manage the deaths that they expect to be coming when they have to shut down.
I want to ask one sort of side note here, just on the timing of it, because there are rules about like what you can and can't introduce into court as evidence, but was anybody able to use Jack's reporting on like the second day of the hearing? Do you know? Did anybody actually get to say like, actually the government is contradicting themselves in public here?
I actually don't know.
Okay.
That would be
we'll have to
find
look into that, because you can't always introduce these kinds of things in that kind of a judicial procedure. Anyways, I was curious. So do we know what happens next?
So the charter challenge is going to go ahead. They haven't ruled yet on the injunction. So there will be a ruling at some point, and this is one of those cases where it it could be soon, but they didn't rule immediately after the final arguments were made. The charter challenge itself will be over this argument we've touched upon about whether the closure of these sites will violate the charter right to life and safety and security of the person. They argue that it forces people into unsafe consumption, which will result in them dying. But the province is arguing that by banning the sites, they are undoing harm because there's sort of drug dealing and antisocial behavior around these sites. One of the biggest example of this is the death of a woman who was shot outside a supervised consumption site in Toronto. In the meantime, the province is setting up heart hubs. So this is services for drug users, but on a no supervised consumption, no harm reduction supply, is more of an abstinence-based models for services. And they've been funding these in the places where the consumption sites have been shutting down, and other places as well.
Yeah, and these sites, I mean, I think the critics would say that they are not going to be as effective because they are not going to offer the same range of services that the supervised consumption sites are able to offer. This is a whole debate that is happening in multiple provinces right now about what is the proper and effective way to do addiction treatment. We're not going to settle that argument today on the podcast, but I do think that it's going to be one of those issues that obviously, I mean, well, we've got 4 years of this new legislature, and it's going to be one we're going to be spending a lot of time paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, you can send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. And Jessica, as the guest, would you like to do the honor and read today's letter?
I would love to. So this comes from an anonymous listener, very mysterious.
We do periodically allow people to submit anonymously, yes.
I wonder if their identity is so interesting they had to hide it.
Well, I actually know who it is, but I'm not going to divulge it on camera.
Okay, this person emailed in to let everyone know that Queen's Park is heading for a milestone.
Yes.
Here's the letter. Hello. I noticed a Facebook post from the wife of one of our new Northern Ontario MPPs, Bill Rosenberg. Janine wrote about his swearing-in ceremony and said that he was the 1,981st person to be a member at Queen's Park. This made me wonder if that 1,981 figure is accurate. Did we roll over to 2,000 during this election? And if not, is it time to start a hashtag #OnPolyPool? We could take odds on which party, region, riding, or candidate will be number 2,000 and give away some sweet TVO swag to whomever makes the right guess. If anyone would have the interest and ability to investigate this, it'd be you folks.
So I'm not sure if as a public agency we can get involved in gambling, but, you know, we're always looking for different revenue streams for the public purse. We did do a little digging on this issue, and it turns out that a previous clerk of the House went back and counted every single person who had ever been elected to Queen's Park, going all the way back to 1867. There have been, as of this most recent election, 1,993 unique individuals that have been elected to the Legislative Assembly since Confederation. That includes not just general elections, but by-elections. Those 1,993 people have contested something like 4,600 seats in the, 24 elections now? So we didn't quite hit 2,000. Over the next 4 years, could we see 7 by-elections? I mean, that's not impossible, right? Like, I think in some years we've seen 7 by-elections. So perhaps we might make it to number 2,000. I certainly intend to keep count. Yeah. And I will definitely be alerting our listeners and viewers if we do in fact hit that 2,000 number. This was one of those ones that was totally new to me. I had no idea that these numbers were being kept. And I've been at Queen's Park for a bit more than a decade now, and I like that there are still fun new traditions to learn about.
I love to think of the former clerk sitting there going, okay, let's start at the beginning, begin at the beginning, and counting and going through and probably recounting to make sure no one was missed.
Oh, I'm certain, yes. And you know, I am told that, well, even you can just judge from this letter, I have been told that MPPs really do like these numbers. They get attached to these numbers. So, yeah.
Awesome. And if anyone wants to email it a guess, TVO will keep it on file and they'll send you a button if you get it right. So a bit of a slow burn on this game. It may take 4 years.
Be patient. That's what we're asking for. All right. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org. And that's the On Poly podcast for this March 28th, 2025.
You can follow On Poly Podcast on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew for making this video podcast happen. And thank you to Jessica Smith-Cross for joining us this week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Let's start this discussion with two numbers. This is from Shachi's polling firm Angus Reid. At the end of last year, the federal NDP was polling at 21% support. Fast forward yesterday, and they are down to a whopping 7%. Shachi, I'm going to start with you. How should we understand what's happening here?
Well, I mean, basically what we're seeing is the NDP's lunch get eaten by the Liberals. The party's support base is being hollowed out, and we have seen a dramatic stampede of NDP supporters abandon the NDP, at least for the time being, and I'll circle back on that, in favor of the Liberals. So what's going on that front? Well, there's a couple of factors. First of all, with Pierre Poilievre finishing last year with a 20-plus point lead, I think a lot of center-left voters have made decisions around trying to create an anybody but conservatives or anybody but Poilievre situation, and they are choosing to vote strategically and with their feet for a left of center or a centrist candidate that they feel would be best to block Poilievre. There's also just the practicalities of the fact that many current NDP voters are actually not really enamored of the choice that they have in Jagmeet Singh. When we asked NDPers last December, well before Trump, well before the tariff threats, well before the trade war, what they thought about their current leader, did they think that the NDP would be doing better under a different leader? Fully 56% said, yeah, we actually do think the party would be doing better under a different leader. So some of this is leadership. We've seen Singh's own favorability numbers trend down and downward over the last 2 years. That continues. And some of this is really just the perennial issue of where does the left of center vote sit in Canada. And we saw same parallels in 2015, where the NDP vote actually abandoned Tom Mulcair and went over to Justin Trudeau, and the Liberals deemed him to be progressive enough for their choice. And, you know, somewhat ironically, the fact that we're seeing NDP voters abandon Singh for a central banker who's making a lot of noises about fiscal discipline, let's see if that holds. What's really important is the center-left vote is very mutable. It moves around, it changes, and I'm not entirely sure on the Tuesday after the Sunday election writ drop that those votes are locked in, but that's certainly where they are at the moment.
All right. On Sunday, the NDP sent out an email saying when it comes to selecting candidates, it is entering the race with a record-breaking momentum. Yeah. How would you characterize the state the NDP are entering this race in?
So there's a couple of things that are quite great. We're already, and New Democrats actually go through nomination meetings for their candidates. It's not anointments and appointments like other parties are allowed to do. You can't just wave a bibbidi-bobbidi-boop magic wand and here's all your candidates. So that does take a little longer, but it was, we started the writ issuance, and shout out to Steve Paikin, it's never a writ drop. But we had about 230, 240 candidates that were already getting ready to knock on doors and already had been knocking on doors. So great momentum start. I'll also give people a bit of history that going into the 2011 campaign, Jack Layton was somewhere in that 10-11% range at the start of that campaign and ended up living in Stornoway come the end of the election. So strange things happen, wonderful things can happen on the campaign trail. It really just depends on how these candidates all show up during the campaign. Do they have momentum? Do they have candidates? Are they able to weather the storm? And what we've seen out of Mr. Carney and his inability to answer simple questions like, what's in your portfolio? How many millions and millions have you made off of buying up real estate and charging outrageous rents to homeowners, including here in Toronto? How do you expect people to believe you're accountable when you won't be accountable on the basic things like how much money do you have and where are you invested and where are your ethics obligations? Those are problematic things for Mr. Carney going into this. And it's why some of those progressive voters who might have been like, oh, okay, not Trudeau, great, let's check out the new guy, kick the tires and go, oh, wait, he's not one of us. He's not part of our team. Where do we go? So then we start to look at, as we saw in the Ontario election, the voter efficiency of New Democrats is extraordinary. Bonnie Crombie was at 30% on election night, didn't have a seat for herself and only had 14 seats. And Marit Stiles has 27 MPPs and is the leader of the official opposition.
21% to 7, that's a pretty big drop.
So what we're seeing, and you would have seen, and I'm sure people were on this program saying, Marit Stiles is going to get no seats. And here she is with 27 in official opposition. So there is a voter efficiency that I'm certain that every pollster will tell you doesn't actually get picked up in those big top line numbers. And I know this because we see it in campaign after campaign. Jagmeet is a seasoned pro. He knows what it's like being on the campaign trail every day and in the scrutiny of media every single day. He's so incredibly focused on who he's in it for, why he's doing this. And he has people who run up to him every day talking about their experience of getting dental care. A program that the Liberals told us said they will absolutely not be able to do in anything less than 7 years and maybe not even then, and we shouldn't hold our breath. And now millions and millions and millions of Canadians are having these programs and access to these services that they wouldn't have but for the adult in the room, Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats.
All right, you mentioned the pollster. We will get to Sachi shortly, but I want to get David into this. How would you characterize the state of the NDP right now?
On a wing and a prayer. I mean, it's true. Things can happen. Lots of things can happen. We've seen the NDP collapse in 1993 to whatever it was, 9 seats. We saw them soar to official opposition. Campaigns matter. That point is important. Not long ago, many of us, including myself, were saying, look, the Liberals are cooked. They're done. Pierre Poilievre is the next Prime Minister of Canada. Now they're like, well, okay, fine, but events. But let's talk about that event. The thing that's shaken up Canadian politics in this election is Donald Trump. If the Liberals are looking back and saying, well, why do we go from nowhere to somewhere? The answer is, well, Justin Trudeau leaves. But Donald Trump starts talking like William McKinley or James Monroe. Someone must have told him who those people were. Someone must have given Donald Trump a president's first president's book, and he learned of these figures, and now we're having to deal with this annexation threat, and that's upended our politics. But now the NDP are caught in this situation where we've got a polarized red-blue race, and they're kind of nowhere. And in political science, we talk about Duverger's law. It's very, very nerdy and arcane, and no one outside of political science likes it, but it's kind of important. And it says basically that in a first-past-the-post system like ours, you sort of get a two-party system. You're meant to, except for there's all these exceptions where you don't get that. And in Canada, we're one of those exceptions. We don't really have that polarized two-party system like they do in, say, British Columbia in the provincial party system. But we don't have that federally. But every so often in elections, we kind of get a simulacrum of it, which is what we're having now. And someone in that situation needs to be pushed out. And right now, that's the NDP. So it's going to be difficult for them, though not impossible, to say, no, we have a value proposition here. We offer something. In fact, we're different. And, this might be getting slightly ahead of us here, but I'll just note it. If I'm the NDP, I'm fighting like hell to get that across by saying, like, look, there's 2 Tories running for the prime minister here. We're the different ones. The question is, will voters hear that if their question is, who can best deal with Donald Trump?
We're going to do an excerpt here because you've got a piece in the Globe and Mail recently, the title of which, "The United States is Putting the United States in Danger." And here's what you wrote. "It's apparent to almost everyone in the world over that the United States is rapidly descending into authoritarianism. We are observing routine attacks on democratic institutions, the undermining of the rule of law, daily assaults on the press, politicization of government agencies, including intelligence and law enforcement agencies, the encouragement of political violence, the deliberate evisceration of formal checks and balances, and outright corruption and self-enrichment. As these practices become normalized in the United States, they will have major consequences for security worldwide, including, ironically, in the United States." Okay.
Nothing wrong there.
Well, it sounds like there is. That was just a few days ago you had that piece up. Now, you had a recent assignment in Washington, D.C., which takes us to the States. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, actually, those comments in the Globe and Mail came about because I was asked to brief members and staff of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about this topic that we've been discussing, about mercenary spyware, something I've done numerous times. And normally that's a great honor to do something like that. It's an important stakeholder body. If you can explain to them the importance of this and they can take action, that's important for us in this area. But I actually did a big pause. I thought long and hard about whether even to accept this invitation. I'm an officer of the Order of Canada. My father was a World War II veteran who served overseas to fight fascism. And here, as this invitation comes in, the President of the United States is threatening repeatedly to annex my country. So I decided I would write up these remarks and just deliver them in the same way that they're actually printed in the Globe and Mail. That's a verbatim transcript of what I said. And my comments to them were, look, everyone in the world can see what's going on. You're really destroying yourself. You're destroying your country. And a committee like that has an important role to play. As you know, we talked about oversight here in Ontario. That's one of their jobs down there, and they need to step up and prevent and check the descent into this kind of cruel techno-fascism that we're seeing.
Did you hear back?
Actually, one of the staff members of a senator said you should publish those remarks, and that's why I sent them to the Globe and Mail.
Back to your quote from the piece. As Trump's chaotic style of governing continues, what impact do you think this is going to have on cybersecurity around the world?
It's a disaster. I mean, in the book I described, there's a bright light in the book at the end where we had great success advocating for the United States to take measures to regulate this industry. And President Biden signed an executive order prohibiting 18 U.S. federal agencies from procuring spyware from companies like NSO Group. I briefed the White House staff. I played a role in bringing about those regulations. It's kind of like for a political scientist winning the Holy Grail to have President Biden sign an executive order. Now all of that's up in the air, of course. And given the extent to which they're basically steamrolling over the rule of law, over checks and balances, that will be noticed around the world. It will legitimize the same actions abroad. Despots and authoritarian regimes will say if the United States is doing it, we'll do it too. And I have great fears that those regulations will now be rolled back, which will precipitate even greater proliferation of this very powerful technology with all of the harmful consequences that we've documented.
What do we do, Ron, about a case, though, where 50% of the United States, 50% of its citizens think if Donald Trump thinks it needs to be done, then we're okay with that?
That's a tough nut to crack. It's how we ended up in this place, how they ended up in this place is very complex political, sociological phenomenon. I honestly don't have an easy answer for that, other than I think it's important for people in that country to realize just how far they've gone off the deep end. And that's why, in part, I wrote those comments because, we're obviously concerned about our security here in Canada. Many other countries around the world are as well. But U.S. citizens should be concerned about their own security because they're really shooting themselves in the foot right now.
I want to pull up a study. A 2024 study from Dalhousie University estimated that around 900,000 to 1.4 million Canadians were taking a GLP-1 drug. Now, 57.1% said they were taking it for type 2 diabetes, 27.2% said they were taking for weight loss, 11.6% said that they were taking for both weight loss and type 2 diabetes, and then 4.1% said other. Now, I'm curious about this 4.1%. I don't know, I'm sure there's a few things there, but Dr. Sokolingam, do we know what else people could be using GLP-1 drugs for?
Well, I think you alluded to it earlier that I think there are maybe some people who are taking it maybe for weight loss, but maybe an off-label for other things and cravings in other realms. There has been a lot of debate and discussion and emerging research on the use of GLP-1s for cravings and curbing kind of addictions, for example. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that 4.1% is that group. Right. It's still pretty early for that. But I do wonder if, for example, some people may be using it to curb other cravings. There are some animal studies and some early human studies that looked at nicotine use and alcohol use and looking at associations and reductions. But larger trials are currently underway. I would say the other is other people may be using it for these fluctuations in weight that might not be weight loss, but weight cosmetic weight modification. People cycling or tinkering with their with little small doses to help with modulation of weight maintenance.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah. All right, Nishtep, that estimate that I gave, 900,000 to 1.4 million, sounds like a large number, but I should have mentioned that study is from 2024.
Okay.
A lot of time can change. I'm curious, do we think that number could be a lot higher? Do we have a rough idea of how many people are using something like Ozempic?
Well, I can definitely say in the past year and a half in my practice, in my clinic, the use has skyrocketed. So even if I looked at it as a percentage of patients that I would see and clients that I would serve, it's definitely quite a large percent of people for the variety of reasons that you're describing. It really isn't, the majority of people that I am seeing on this drug are not actually taking it for the management of type 2 diabetes. They may already be taking medications for the management of that, and they've started this drug to kind of start the process of trying to manage their weight. So I do actually think the number is probably higher.
I am curious, it sounds like an obvious question, the application of something like Ozempic or Wegovy, how does it apply?
It is an injectable drug, and it is something that has to be dosed properly. So it is something that you would start off with a starting dose, and then you work up to a maximum dose with the physician, and that does take time. And then you also have to attribute and take time for understanding how people will react. The one thing I want to say is of all of the different clients and patients that are using this drug, it's very individualized reactions and very individualized results as well. So we want to make sure that patients are aware of that.
All right, I want to pick up on that with Dr. Drucker. These individualized sort of reactions. I also want to talk about side effects as well. What are some of the side effects people can experience if they are taking this medication?
So the most common side effects are nausea, diarrhea, constipation, and vomiting. Those occur in about half the people who take them. They tend to be transient, and we see them when people start the drug or where they increase the dose. About 90-95% of people after a few months will not have any of those side effects. Then, more rarely gallbladder disease, sometimes dehydration, if you really are unable to eat and drink. So we have to counsel people about this. Then there's some more controversial things. People talk about rare types of eye disease or rare types of kidney disease or pancreatitis, etc. Those actually have not being definitively proven, but they are something that we discuss. And the important thing which we've heard about is we can start a low dose and go slowly. So the acronym sort of start low, go slow. Mm-hmm. We don't have to repeat the rapidity of which we increase the dose of these medicines that are done in the clinical trials. We should not increase the dose of these medicines in people who have any side effects. We should wait till they become used to the medicines and go much more slowly. It often takes 10, 15, 20 years to gain a lot of weight. We don't have to reverse that in 6 or 9 months. So we have to have an individualized approach to management.
All right, Dr. Sockolingo, I'm curious, when I'm thinking of a type 2 diabetes medication, I'm thinking of metformin or something like that, something that, I'm not throwing my mom under the bus when she has to take it. She has to take it every day. I am curious with something like Ozempic, do people need to take that drug? Do they need to stay on it forever to be able to see it? Or if they get off of it, will they see a reverse?
Well, I think it comes back to Nisha's earlier comment that obesity is a chronic medical condition, right? So with diabetes, right, it is a condition that we manage for the rest of our life through various interventions. It doesn't always have to be medications. It's often multi-component, and that applies to obesity as well. And even though we've accepted obesity as a chronic disease in the medical field for some time, in society, it's still an uphill struggle with respect to that. So how does this relate to patients? I do counsel patients on this. It's the first question they ask is, how long do I have to stay on this? And I do say it is like any other chronic disease, like diabetes. If you had high blood pressure, for example, you're going to stay on the medications to manage that, and you're going to do a whole bunch of other things as well in terms of behavioral, lifestyle modification, and so on. And then we will reassess over time. But for many patients, they do have to stay on these medications for a longer period of time. And I'm committed to working with them on that. And that's, I think, the main thing is that we reassess together. It really is something we have to educate, because many people see that initial benefit and want to go off the medication because they're better, just like antibiotics. Right? You cure your infection, you want to go off it. So we do have to counsel patients with respect to that.
All right. Nisha, are GLP-1 drugs a sustainable form of weight loss?
Well, that's the question of the day. And the way that I would look at it is, it's like so many other interventions we've had in the past 20 or 30 years to try to attack obesity. It is a tool in the toolbox. So it is something that can be absolutely utilized to help with sustainable habits. But I think in and of itself, it's not a quick fix or the answer to everything, because as we've heard today, there are so many factors that influence obesity and the development of it, and it's a chronic disease. So it is something that people will manage over time or over many years, or have been, and therefore I do think it is an important tool. I think it's a useful tool. The sustainability really does come into play when you look at what are the other pieces that we can help patients and clients get into place, because I do think there's multiple factors that need to be activated for this drug to even have its most potent and beneficial effect. So that's the way I kind of look at it, similar to many other interventions over the years, that as soon as they are kind of on the market, people are very excited about them, and they kind of think, oh, this is the quick ticket. We really don't want to do that with this time. There's amazing benefits to these drugs, but I do think we want to think of it as one tool in a multi-tool box.
Menopause is something that we don't really talk about. And now it seems like we're living through a time when a lot of celebrities are talking about. Trish, what do you make of that moment right now that's happening right now?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about it because more has happened in the last 12 months on menopause than the last 1,200 years, probably. So I'm really excited that we are talking about menopause. And it's so critical because, as Dr. Wolfman said, women underestimate, but society underestimates the length of time that this is happening for. Perimenopause can happen 2 to 10 years before menopause. Postmenopause goes on until you die. So we're in a long, long period, decades, where women can be suffering from symptoms that are having a huge impact on her health, on her life, on her ability to work, on her ability to care for elders, children, etc. So it's a huge issue that as a society, as a workplace, as a healthcare system, we must address.
And Christina, we know that 100% of women will have some kind of symptoms of perimenopause, menopause. We'll go through this, yet we're only talking about it really now. Can you talk to us a little bit about how it impacts people's daily lives?
Oh, I mean, it's massive. I wrote a story for the Toronto Star about this a couple of months ago, and one of the people I spoke with was a gynecologist here in Calgary. She has a 2-year wait list for people who want to see her about their menopause symptoms, but she was struggling with brain fog and memory loss and forgetting the word for things that she used in the operating room. And she didn't even recognize those symptoms in herself. And so she went and she saw her doctor to say, like, am I going to be able to continue working? And so I think it's that pervasive. It's forgetting things at work. It's having the hot flashes when you're sitting there with your friends. It's absolutely not being able to sleep at night. It's all of these things.
And it's weird because within my friend circle anyway, even on social media, a lot of us seem to get up at the same time in the middle of the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning. You're just up. And when you think about your career, a lot of us during this time, we're doing, we're in senior positions of leadership. And it's frightening to see, like when you're dealing with brain fog, how that could impact your career. Dr. Wolfman, can you help us understand what's happening to our brain during this stage of life?
Can I digress a bit?
Oh,
because we got as far as the menopause, and I want to be clear that the symptoms that occur due to lack of estrogen are different. And the really important symptoms are hot flashes, which is a sensation of heat or warmth, starting in the chest and moving upward to the head and neck. Night sweats, which interrupt sleep, and therefore may impact cognition. Also, you talk about brain fog, which is not a well-defined term. And then also, we know about 40% of women have sleep issues, mood changes, especially in women who are vulnerable to changes in mood around hormonal change, like puberty, postpartum, and then around menopause. But there can also be new changes in mood, such as irritability, anger, even people can have panic attacks around menopause.
I want to show a chart that illustrates Canada's significant trade relation with the U.S. This is the share of Canada's merchandise exports by region in 2023. Now, you can see in this donut graph, a large swath of it, 77.1% in red, that's the United States. Latin America and Caribbean in teal at 2.9%, the Indo-Pacific 10.8 in purple, and in pink, Europe and Central Asia, and then in blue, little tiny little sliver there, the Middle East and Africa at 1.6%. Meredith, I'm going to come to you first. Different Canadian governments have talked about diversifying our trade partners for years, but there never seems to be much progress. What are the reasons Canada leans so heavily on the U.S. when it comes to our exports?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. So I think the reason that Canadian firms rely so heavily, despite the fact that, as you say, different governments have sought to open up market access through things like free trade agreements and trade missions and those kinds of things, the reason firms continue to trade with the United States is actually because it makes a lot of sense to do so. The U.S. is the world's largest market. It's right next door to Canada. It has very similar regulatory practices and a similar business environment to Canada. So for our firms, it's actually quite easy and profitable for them to trade with the United States. There's something called the gravity model in economics that predicts that all of these factors mean the U.S. can and should be Canada's primary trade destination. And so firms are going to only look to other markets if there's a business case to do so. And what they're going to be looking for is things like a stable business environment, opportunities to make profit. But firms are not charities. They're not looking to move to new markets to promote Canadian values or foreign policy. Those might be nice side benefits, but that's not what they're in it for. They're in it primarily to make money. And the other thing I think you should be aware of is that for the most part, Canada's large firms are operating in multiple markets. They trade with the United States, but roughly half of them also trade with an additional market beyond the United States. And so when we're now looking to encourage other firms in Canada to explore new markets, we're mostly looking at small and medium business. And they have many reasons that you can imagine that it might be kind of daunting to explore new markets. So, maybe we can get into it. I think the tariff situation might change that, but there are good reasons that Canadian firms historically have mostly traded with the United States.
Very quickly on that, when you talk about that stability, the small and medium businesses, Meredith, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business just came out with a report that said 47% of small businesses don't consider the U.S. a reliable trade partner. Is the U.S. a reliable trade partner, looking at it right now where we stand?
right now today, I don't think it's giving the signals that it is. And actually, signals matter a lot. The signals of how reliable a market is can be as important as the reality of it. And so at the moment, the signals being sent from the United States is that it is not a reliable trade partner. And so small firms, for instance, if a shipment was caught up at the border and that was caught up for a very long period of time, a large firm might be able to weather that and would have resources in place to help them kind of unstick the problems associated with that shipment being caught at the border. But a small business can't necessarily take on that liability. And so they have different considerations when they think about whether or not the U.S. is reliable and whether they have the resources to help them weather those kinds of challenges.
All right, Mark, I feel like I'm going to need a little history lesson here. But is the trend of the U.S. becoming more insular when it comes to international trade new or not?
I don't think it's really all that new. I think that if when you look back at these things, as I spend my day doing this for the last 40 plus years, I think probably the United States started to move inward probably in the Clinton administration. It's a bit confusing for us in Canada, I guess, because it started right around the time that NAFTA the old free trade agreement was converted to NAFTA. And the Clinton got elected really campaigning against NAFTA and then let it go through by adding a labor and environmental hook to it. And then the work that had already been in progress towards a WTO agreement, that sort of was already on its way. But by that time, you can sort of see Ross Perot, running a famously anti-trade third-party candidacy that meant that Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote. And then you take it to the Bush administration, and they're acting unilaterally. And then I think that even after the WTO came into existence, early decisions of the WTO, especially after China joined, meant that the Americans pretty immediately were saying, that's not what we negotiated for. And every presidency since then has sort of seen a little bit moving backwards. I think what Trump changes is from the rhetoric to sort of real threats. I think the world had probably got used to, and especially us in Canada, just tuning it out. 2% of NATO requirements. What did he say? I didn't hear that. What do you want me to do with, digital services tax? Sorry, Mr. Biden, I didn't hear you. And Trump comes along, and it's the ultimate expression. Well, I'm going to say it in a way and do it in a way that you're going to listen to me. And he's not just doing that to Canada, but to the rest of the world. As the old post-war, post-World War II model was a model where the United States was the economic superpower and the military superpower, and it engaged in what maybe the rest of the world wouldn't like to admit, but asymmetric trade liberalization. It opened its large consumer market and said to the rest of the world, come and sell to us, which we'd been doing for hundreds of years here in Canada, and the rest of the world joined. Now, as they have more competitors, first in the 70s and the 80s with Japan and Germany, and then with the rising China in the 90s, the Americans are saying, we want to redo the terms of that bargain. And I think the world has been struggling ever since to figure out how to do that.
That is the agenda for Friday, March 28th, 2025. Monday on the program, we'll sit down with the mayor of Sudbury to hear how the Nickel City can help Canada in its trade war with the U.S. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again on Monday.